A millionaire encounters a black woman wearing his late wife's ring. As the truth comes to light, what unexpected connection will be exposed, reshaping their futures? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Plaza Hotel buzzed with the characteristic sounds of New York's elite gathering for their annual charity gala. Richard Hayes stood near the champagne fountain, his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo setting him apart even in this crowd of wealthy donors. At 62, his silver hair and commanding presence typically drew attention, but tonight he felt strangely disconnected from the familiar faces and rehearsed pleasantries surrounding him. The conversations around him focused on stock portfolios and recent acquisitions, punctuated by occasional forced laughter. Richard checked his watch. Barely an hour had passed, though it felt like an eternity. Since losing his wife, Catherine, 2 years ago, these events had become increasingly difficult to endure. The emptiness of the social interactions struck him more profoundly with each passing month. A slight commotion near the art exhibition section caught his attention. The crowd parted to reveal a striking woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a deep purple evening gown that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin. She moved through the space with natural grace, stopping occasionally to discuss the artwork on display. Richard learned from nearby whispers that she was Maya Johnson, the curator responsible for selecting the evening's featured pieces. What caught Richard's eye, however, wasn't her obvious beauty or the way she commanded attention. It was the glint of something familiar on her right hand, a ring he would have recognized anywhere. The distinctive Art Deco design featured a central sapphire surrounded by small diamonds in a geometric pattern. His heart nearly stopped. He had last seen that ring on Catherine's hand the day she died. Richard made his way across the room, his usual social polish temporarily forgotten, as he focused on getting closer to examine the ring. The conversation around him faded to background noise. He arrived at the exhibition area just as Maya finished explaining the significance of a large abstract canvas to a group of potential donors. The interplay of light and shadow represents the duality in all of us, she was saying, her voice carrying authority and warmth. The artist challenges us to examine our own contradictions. Richard waited for the group to disperse before approaching. "I couldn't help but notice your interpretation of Thompson's work," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "You've captured exactly what Sarah was trying to convey in her series." Maya turned to face him, her expression professional, but genuinely interested. "You know Sarah Thompson's work?" "I've collected her pieces for years," Richard replied, trying not to stare at the ring on her hand. "I'm Richard Hayes." "Maya Johnson," she responded, extending her hand. The ring caught the light, and Richard had to force himself not to react. "I'm surprised to meet someone here who actually knows contemporary art beyond its investment potential." The tension between them was immediate and complex. Richard recognized it wasn't just about the ring. There was something in Maya's presence that commanded attention, a combination of intelligence and authenticity that stood out in the artificial atmosphere of the gala. They fell into a discussion about the current state of the art world, with Maya offering insights that challenged several of Richard's long-held assumptions. Her perspective on accessibility in fine art and the importance of diverse voices in galleries made him uncomfortably aware of his own limited viewpoint. Throughout their conversation, Richard's eyes kept returning to the ring. Each glimpse sent a jolt through him, raising questions he couldn't ignore. How had this woman come to possess Catherine's ring? What connection could possibly exist between his late wife and this talented, outspoken curator? The evening around them continued its predictable pattern. Drinks were served, checks were written, photographs were taken. But in their corner of the ballroom, something unexpected was taking shape. Richard felt himself drawn into Maya's orbit, not just by the mystery of the ring, but by her passionate dedication to her work and her unflinching honesty about the art world's shortcomings. As their conversation deepened, Richard noticed subtle signs of Maya's own guardedness. When he mentioned his late wife in passing, something flickered across Maya's expression, recognition, perhaps, or concern. The ring on her finger suddenly seemed to carry more weight than just its physical presence. It became clear that both of them were holding back, each aware that this chance meeting might lead to revelations neither was fully prepared to face. The elegant crowd at the gala had thinned considerably, leaving Richard and Maya in a relatively quiet corner near a dramatic floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city lights. Richard's curiosity about the ring had been building throughout their conversation, creating an almost physical pressure in his chest. He could no longer contain his need to know. "That ring you're wearing," Richard began, his voice carefully controlled despite his internal turbulence. "It's quite remarkable. Would you mind telling me about it?" He watched Maya's face intently, noting how her expression shifted from openness to guarded caution in a fraction of a second. Maya's hand moved instinctively to cover the ring, a gesture that didn't escape Richard's notice. She remained silent for a moment, studying him with newfound wariness. The comfortable rapport they'd built discussing art seemed to evaporate, replaced by a heavy tension that filled the space between them. "The ring belonged to my grandmother," Maya finally said, her voice measured and deliberate. "It's been passed down through generations of women in my family, each one adding their own story to its legacy." She paused, then added with subtle emphasis, "It's a symbol of strength and resilience in my family." Richard felt his world tilt slightly. The ring he'd given Catherine on their 10th anniversary had been an antique, yes, but he'd purchased it from a respected dealer in Manhattan. The idea that it had a history beyond what he knew, a history that somehow connected to the woman standing before him, seemed impossible. "My late wife Catherine had a ring exactly like that one," Richard said, watching Maya's reaction carefully. "The design is quite unique. I've never seen another like it." He noticed Maya's shoulders tense slightly at the mention of Catherine's name. Maya took a slow breath before responding. "Mr. Hayes," she began formally, creating emotional distance between them, "family heirlooms often carry complicated histories. This ring represents more than just jewelry to me. It's a reminder of the battles my grandmother fought, the dignity she maintained in the face of discrimination, and the legacy she left for future generations." Richard found himself caught between his need to understand the ring's connection to Catherine and his growing awareness of Maya's defensive posture. The implications of what she was saying and what she wasn't saying began to take shape in his mind. "Please," he said softly, "I'm not trying to challenge your ownership. I'm simply trying to understand. Catherine wore that ring for 15 years. It meant everything to her." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he saw Maya's expression soften. Maya studied him for a long moment, then gestured to a nearby seating area. As they sat down, she turned the ring on her finger, a habitual gesture that spoke of deep familiarity. "My grandmother, Rose Johnson, worked as a housekeeper for several wealthy families in the 1960s, she began. She rarely spoke about that time, but she always said this ring represented a promise, though she never explained what kind of promise. Richard listened intently, his mind racing to connects that seemed impossibly far apart. The timeline didn't make sense. He'd purchased the ring in the 1990s. Yet Maya spoke with such conviction about its place in her family's history. "There's more to the story," Maya admitted, "but some things need to remain private, at least for now." She met his gaze directly, her eyes conveying both strength and uncertainty. "I hope you can understand that." The evening was drawing to a close around them, staff beginning the subtle process of clearing glasses and dimming lights. Richard realized they'd been talking for hours, yet he felt further from understanding the ring's true history than when he'd first spotted it. However, something else had taken shape during their conversation, a connection that transcended his initial fixation on the jewelry. Maya stood, smoothing her dress with practiced grace. "Thank you for a fascinating evening, Mr. Hayes," she said, reaching into her clutch to withdraw a business card. "If you'd like to continue our discussion about the Art Foundation some other time, you can reach me here." Richard accepted the card, noting the simple, elegant design identifying her as the executive curator at the Johnson Gallery. The ring caught the light one final time as Maya turned to leave, sending a cascade of questions through Richard's mind. He watched her disappear into the dispersing crowd, knowing with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The following week found Richard in his office at Hayes Enterprises, unable to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. Maya's business card lay beside his computer, its edges slightly worn from his repeated handling. After days of internal debate, he finally picked up his phone and dialed the number. Maya agreed to meet him at a small cafe near her gallery, away from the pretense of the corporate world. When Richard arrived, she was already seated at a corner table, dressed in a professional blazer and examining documents spread before her. The ring remained on her finger, catching afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. "I've been doing some research," Richard began after they exchanged greetings. He pulled out a leather portfolio and removed several old photographs. "This is Catherine's grandmother, Elizabeth Wells, taken in 1965. He slid a black and white photograph across the table, showing an elegant woman standing beside a grand staircase. Maya studied the photograph, her expression carefully neutral. After a moment, she reached into her own bag and withdrew a worn envelope. "This is my grandmother, Rose Johnson, from the same year." The photograph she produced showed a younger woman in a housekeeper's uniform, standing in what appeared to be the same house. "They knew each other," Richard said softly, not a question but a revelation. "Elizabeth Wells employed your grandmother." Maya nodded slowly. Rose worked for the Wells family for nearly a decade, but their relationship was complicated. She hesitated, then continued. "My grandmother kept detailed journals. Elizabeth Wells wasn't just her employer. They became friends, secret friends, during one of the most turbulent times in our city's history." Richard listened as Maya revealed how Elizabeth Wells, despite her privileged position, had secretly supported civil rights initiatives in the 1960s. She used her social connections and wealth to help fund legal defense funds and education programs, all while maintaining the appearance of a proper society woman. Elizabeth faced tremendous pressure from her social circle to maintain the status quo, Richard explained, sharing what he knew from Catherine's stories. But she believed in equality and justice, even when it cost her friendships and social standing. Rose wrote about that, Maya confirmed. She described how Elizabeth would host elaborate parties for her wealthy friends, then use the occasions to quietly gather donations for civil rights organizations. Rose helped her manage the secret correspondence and keep records. As they talked, the true significance of the ring began to emerge. Elizabeth had given it to Rose not as payment or charity, but as a symbol of their shared commitment to fighting injustice. The ring had been passed down through Rose's family as a reminder of that bond and the courage it represented. But how did it come to be with Catherine? Maya asked, voicing the question that had puzzled both of them. Richard's face showed his growing understanding. "The ring was sold during a difficult period in your family's history, wasn't it?" he asked gently. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Rose lost everything in a fire in the late 1980s. She had to sell the ring to help rebuild. She never told us who bought it, only that she hoped it would somehow find its way back to our family someday. The revelation struck Richard like a physical blow. "I bought it from an estate sale in 1992. The dealer never mentioned its history." He paused, remembering Catherine's immediate attraction to the ring. Catherine always said it felt like it had a story to tell. She wore it every day until she died, Maya finished softly. "And now, through what seems like impossible coincidence, it's found its way back to my family." The weight of their shared history settled over them. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a physical link between their families, carrying decades of struggle, hope, and resilience in its delicate metalwork. "There's more," Maya said, pulling out additional journal pages. Rose and Elizabeth didn't just work together on civil rights issues. They created an underground network of women helping other women, crossing racial and social boundaries that seemed insurmountable at the time. Richard absorbed this information, seeing his late wife's grandmother in a new light. The sophisticated society woman in the photographs had led a double life, using her privilege to fight for change while maintaining a careful facade of conformity. The afternoon light had shifted to evening shadows as they continued sharing stories, piecing together the remarkable connection between their families. Both realized that the ring's reappearance wasn't just coincidence. It was an invitation to continue the work their grandmothers had begun. The discovery of their family's intertwined history created ripples that quickly spread through both Richard's and Maya's social circles. Richard experienced this first at his weekly lunch meeting at the Metropolitan Club, where he'd been a member for over 3 decades. The opulent dining room, with its dark wood paneling and crystal chandeliers, had always represented a sanctuary of privilege and tradition. Marcus Sterling, his longtime friend and fellow board member at several corporations, didn't bother with subtle questioning. "Richard, people are talking about your involvement with that curator from the charity gala, the Johnson woman." He paused deliberately while cutting his steak. "Have you considered how this might affect your position on the hospital board?" The implied threat wasn't lost on Richard. The hospital board position represented more than just prestige. It was his way of continuing Catherine's legacy of healthcare advocacy. Yet for the first time, he found himself questioning the values of the institution he'd long defended. "Maya Johnson is helping me establish a new arts foundation," Richard responded, maintaining his composure while feeling an unfamiliar anger rise. "Her expertise in contemporary art and community outreach is invaluable." "A foundation?" Marcus's wife Patricia interjected from across the table. "Darling, there are dozens of reputable arts organizations you could support without getting personally involved with. Well, you know." Her perfectly manicured hand waved dismissively in the air. Meanwhile, across town at the Johnson Gallery, Maya faced her own confrontations. Her brother Marcus, a civil rights attorney, paced her office with mounting frustration. "Do you realize what you're doing? Getting involved with Richard Hayes? That man's company has been fighting against minority business initiatives for years." Maya sat at her desk, hands clasped tightly together, the ring a constant reminder of the complexity of their situation. "Hayes Enterprises is changing, Marcus. Richard is willing to learn, to understand perspectives he never considered before. Until it affects his bottom line," Marcus countered. "Maya, I've faced his corporate lawyers in court. They don't care about our community's struggles." The pressure mounted from unexpected directions. At a family dinner, Maya's mother Gloria grew unusually quiet when the subject of Richard came up. Finally, she spoke with careful words heavy with history. "Baby, I know you believe in seeing the good in people. But men like Richard Hayes, they live in a different world. They may visit ours, but they always go back to their towers." Richard encountered similar resistance during a board meeting at Hayes Enterprises. His proposal to diversify their art investment portfolio and support emerging artists from underrepresented communities met with thinly veiled skepticism. "The shareholders expect us to maximize returns, not engage in social experiments," commented board member Jonathan Phillips, his tone dismissive. "We're a business, not a charity." The weight of these opposing forces began to affect both Richard and Maya personally. Richard found himself lying awake at night, questioning everything he'd accepted as normal throughout his business career. The casual racism and classism he'd previously overlooked now stood out in sharp relief, making him increasingly uncomfortable in spaces he'd once considered home. Maya struggled with her own doubts. Her curatorial work had always focused on amplifying marginalized voices in the art world. Would collaborating with Richard compromise her principles? Would her community see her as a sellout? The ring on her finger seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. During a particularly difficult week, Richard called Maya to cancel their regular foundation planning meeting. His voice carried the strain of recent confrontations. "Maybe we need to reconsider the timing of this project," he suggested, hating himself for wavering. Maya's response was measured but firm. "Is that Richard Hayes speaking, or the voices of those who prefer the world remain exactly as it is?" The question hung between them, challenging them both to examine their true motivations. That evening, Richard found himself driving to Catherine's grave, seeking some kind of guidance. As he stood before the headstone, the setting sun casting long shadows across the cemetery, he remembered something Catherine had once said: "Comfort is often the enemy of justice." The memory brought both clarity and shame. Richard arrived at the Johnson Gallery early one morning, having made his decision. The gallery occupied a renovated industrial space in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, its large windows letting in streams of natural light that illuminated the contemporary artwork on display. Maya was already there, reviewing installation plans for an upcoming exhibition. "I've been thinking about what Catherine would want," Richard began, settling into a chair in Maya's office. "She always said wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to create positive change. The foundation we're planning, it needs to be more than just another arts organization. It needs to address the systemic barriers that keep talented artists from being seen and heard." Maya set aside her papers, giving him her full attention. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard pulled out a detailed proposal he'd spent the weekend preparing. The Hayes Johnson Foundation for Artistic Innovation and Inclusion, a multi-million-dollar commitment to support artists from underrepresented communities, provide educational programs in underserved areas, and create exhibition spaces that bridge social and economic divides. The first community meeting to discuss the foundation took place in the gallery's main space. Maya had deliberately invited a diverse group: local artists, community activists, educators, and even some of the skeptical board members from Hayes Enterprises. The tension in the room was palpable as Richard stood to present their vision. A local artist named James Rodriguez spoke up first, his voice carrying years of frustration. "We've seen initiatives like this before. They promise change but end up being just another way for rich people to feel good about themselves while maintaining the status quo." Several heads nodded in agreement. Richard felt the familiar urge to become defensive, but remembered Catherine's words about comfort being the enemy of justice. Instead, he acknowledged the criticism. "You're right to be skeptical. I can't change the past, but I can commit to doing things differently now. That's why Maya and I want this foundation to be community-driven. We're here to listen and learn." Maya stepped forward, the ring catching the light as she gestured. "This foundation isn't just about funding. It's about acknowledging and addressing the historical inequities in the art world. We want to create something that honors the legacy of women like Elizabeth Wells and Rose Johnson, who worked across racial and social boundaries to fight for change." The discussion that followed was intense and sometimes uncomfortable. Community members shared stories of being excluded from galleries, denied opportunities, and having their work undervalued. Richard listened, really listened, feeling the weight of his own industry's role in perpetuating these injustices. During a break, an elderly woman approached Richard. She introduced herself as Barbara Thompson, a former student of Rose Johnson's. "Rose used to tell us about Elizabeth Wells," she said quietly, "how they had to meet in secret to plan their initiatives. Now here you are, their grandchildren, doing this work openly. That's progress, even if we still have far to go." The meeting concluded with the formation of a community advisory board, ensuring that local voices would have real power in the foundation's decision-making process. As people began to leave, Maya noticed Richard standing alone, staring at a powerful mural that dominated one wall of the gallery. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, joining him. Richard shook his head. "Actually, I feel more certain than ever. But I'm also more aware of how much I don't know, how much I need to learn." He turned to face her. "Thank you for helping me see what I've been blind to for so long." Maya smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "We're just beginning, Richard. The real work lies ahead." The summer heat had settled over the city when Maya invited Richard to visit her grandmother's old house in Brooklyn. The modest brownstone stood in stark contrast to Richard's Upper East Side penthouse, its worn steps and small gardens speaking to generations of family life. Inside, photographs covered the walls, each one telling a story of struggle and triumph. "Rose raised 3 children here while working 2 jobs," Maya explained, leading Richard through rooms filled with memories. "She cleaned houses during the day and taught art classes in the evening. She believed art could heal wounds and bridge divides." Maya paused before a particularly striking photograph showing Rose standing proudly before a group of students, her expression determined and dignified. Richard noticed how Maya's hand often went to the ring, as she shared these stories, as if drawing strength from its presence. In the small kitchen, Maya prepared coffee using her grandmother's old percolator while continuing her narrative. Every Saturday, Rose would gather neighborhood children here. Some couldn't afford art supplies, so she'd create materials from whatever she could find: newspapers, discarded packaging, even leaves from the garden. She taught them that art wasn't about expensive materials, but about expressing truth. The afternoon light filtered through lace curtains that Rose had hung decades ago, creating intricate patterns on the worn wooden floor. Richard sat at the small kitchen table, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. "Catherine would have loved this," he said softly. "She always said art should be accessible to everyone, but I never truly understood what that meant until now." Maya joined him at the table, setting down 2 mismatched coffee cups. "Tell me about Catherine," she encouraged. "Not just as your wife, but as a person who cared about these issues." Richard's voice grew thick with emotion as he shared memories he'd kept locked away. "Catherine came from wealth, like me, but she never let it isolate her from reality. She volunteered at public schools, teaching art to children. She would come home full of stories about their creativity, their resilience." He paused, struggling with the weight of revelation. "I supported her work financially, but I never really engaged with it. I realize now how much I missed by staying in my comfortable bubble." As evening approached, Maya showed Richard her grandmother's journals, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Rose's elegant handwriting filled pages with observations about life, art, and society. One entry particularly caught Richard's attention. "Today, Elizabeth reminded me that change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from the courage to be uncomfortable, to stand firm when others would have you retreat." The parallel to Catherine's words about comfort being the enemy of justice struck Richard forcefully. "These women, our grandmothers, Catherine, they understood something that took me 62 years to begin to grasp," he admitted. Maya touched his arm gently, the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them. "But you're grasping it now, Richard. That's what matters." Their conversation continued late into the evening, moving from personal histories to their hopes for the foundation. Richard shared his fears about disappointing the community, about not living up to the legacy they were trying to honor. Maya spoke of her own anxieties about maintaining authenticity while working within established power structures. In that modest kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of Rose Johnson's remarkable life, both Richard and Maya felt their connection deepening beyond their initial focus on the ring. They were becoming partners in a journey that would challenge them both, pushing them beyond their comfort zones towards something meaningful and true. A crisp autumn morning shattered their progress when Richard's phone erupted with urgent messages. A conservative blog had published an exposé titled, "Hayes Enterprise Heir Undermines Family Legacy," complete with photos of Richard and Maya at various foundation meetings. The article twisted their work into something sinister, suggesting Richard was being manipulated by radical activists to destabilize traditional art institutions. Within hours, major news outlets picked up the story. The comment sections filled with vitriol, revealing the ugly underbelly of racism and classism that still plague society. Richard's email inbox flooded with messages from board members, business associates, and fellow country club members, all expressing their concern about the direction he was taking. The most damaging blow came from an anonymous source who leaked internal Hayes Enterprises documents, suggesting that Richard had bypassed standard corporate governance procedures in allocating resources to the foundation. Though the allegations were technically incorrect, Richard had used his personal fortune, not company funds. The implication of impropriety stuck. Maya faced her own storm. Her gallery's major donors began withdrawing support, citing concerns about political activism overshadowing artistic merit. Several artists scheduled for upcoming exhibitions requested to postpone, fearing association with the controversy would harm their careers. The community advisory board members found themselves targeted by online harassment. During an emergency meeting at the foundation's temporary offices, Maya's brother Marcus arrived unannounced. "I warned you," he said, dropping a stack of newspapers on the conference table. "They're calling you his token diversity consultant. They're questioning every achievement you've ever had, suggesting you slept your way into your curator position. This is what happens when you try to play their game." Richard, watching Maya's face tighten with pain, felt a familiar urge to retreat to the safety of his privileged world. One phone call to his PR team could distance him from the controversy. A carefully worded statement about taking time to reassess community initiatives would satisfy the board. The pressure from his social circle was intense. His own sister had called, crying about how their parents would have been ashamed. Maya too faced pressure to step away. Her mother arrived at her apartment late one night, bearing comfort food and practical advice. "Sometimes, baby, you have to know when to step back. Your grandmother knew when to fight, and when to live to fight another day." The ring on Maya's finger felt heavier than ever as she considered her mother's words. The foundation's office became eerily quiet as staff members, sensing the impending collapse, began updating their resumes. Richard stopped attending his regular social engagements, unable to bear the mixture of pity and judgment in his peers' eyes. Maya threw herself into gallery work, trying to salvage relationships with artists and donors. One evening, alone in his penthouse, Richard found himself holding the last photo taken of Catherine. "What would you do?" he whispered to her image. The silence that followed was deafening, but in it, he began to hear the echoes of all they had learned about their family's shared history. Elizabeth and Rose hadn't given up when faced with opposition. They had found ways to persist, to fight smarter. Across town, Maya sat in her grandmother's kitchen, reading Rose's journals by lamplight. She found an entry from 1965. "They think they can shame us into silence, but our silence would shame us more. Some storms you weather, others you dance in." Maya chose to confront the controversy head-on by organizing an exhibition titled Inherited Truths at her gallery. The show would feature works exploring family histories, cultural inheritance, and social change. She spent weeks curating pieces that spoke to the complex intersections of race, class, and identity in America. The opening night arrived with tension crackling in the air. News vans parked outside the gallery, their presence both threatening and potentially useful. Inside, Maya stood before the gathered crowd, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She wore a simple black dress, the ring prominently displayed on her hand, no longer hiding its significance. "Art has always been about truth-telling," Maya began, addressing the packed gallery. "Tonight's exhibition examines the truths we inherit from our families, both the comfortable and uncomfortable ones. Every piece here tells a story of transformation, of boundaries crossed and assumptions challenged." She guided the audience through the exhibition, explaining how each artwork connected to broader themes of social justice and change. A series of portraits showed generations of families, their stories of migration, struggle, and triumph captured in oils and photographs. Installation pieces incorporated family heirlooms, their histories reimagined and recontextualized. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a collaborative work Maya had commissioned, a massive multimedia installation incorporating photographs, letters, and documents from both the Wells and Johnson families. It told the story of Elizabeth and Rose's secret friendship, their shared commitment to justice, and the ring that had brought their grandchildren together decades later. Richard had not told Maya whether he would attend. The controversy had taken its toll on him. His hair had grayed further at the temples, and lines of stress marked his face. Yet as Maya concluded her presentation, she saw him enter quietly through the gallery's back door. He moved slowly through the crowd, stopping to really look at each piece, engaging with the artists and community members present. The media, primed for confrontation, watched as Richard made his way to the front of the gallery. Instead of retreating from the controversy, he chose to stand beside Maya. The photographer's cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment when Richard Hayes, billionaire heir, publicly aligned himself with the values their foundation represented. "I've spent most of my life viewing art through the lens of privilege," Richard addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of recent experiences. "I saw it as something to be collected, displayed, invested in. But through working with Maya, through learning about our family's shared history, I've come to understand art's power to challenge, to heal, to unite." He turned to face Maya directly. "The ring that brought us together represents more than just a family connection. It represents a commitment to continue the work our grandmothers began, not in secret this time, but openly and proudly. The exhibition became a turning point. Art critics praised its boldness and authenticity. Community members saw their own stories reflected in the works displayed. Even some of Richard's conservative business associates, attending out of curiosity or obligation, found themselves moved by the honest exploration of American history and identity. Richard spent a long morning in his office at Hayes Enterprises, reviewing the latest board meeting minutes. The exhibition's impact had created ripples throughout New York's business and art communities, forcing many to reconsider their initial opposition. He read through emails from fellow CEOs, some supportive, others still critical, but all acknowledging the foundation's growing influence. The decision he faced wasn't simple. The board had presented him with an ultimatum: either scale back his involvement with the foundation or step down as CEO. They'd couched it in careful corporate language about focusing on core business objectives, but the message was clear. Richard thought about how his father had built this company, remembered countless board meetings where diversity initiatives were quietly shelved in favor of profit margins. Across town, Maya faced her own crossroads at the Johnson Gallery. The exhibition's success had brought international attention, and prestigious museums were offering her curator positions. These roles promised larger budgets, greater influence, and a chance to shape major institutions from within. Her brother Marcus had called them opportunities to effect change at the highest levels. On a Wednesday afternoon, Richard asked Maya to meet him at a small park near the gallery. The autumn air carried a hint of winter, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked. Maya noticed Richard had foregone his usual business suit for a casual sweater and slacks, a small but significant change. "The board wants me to choose," Richard began, stopping near a bench overlooking a small pond. "They're concerned about the company's image, about shareholder value." He smiled slightly. "All tea. He thinks that used to consume my thoughts." Maya twisted the ring on her finger, a habit that had become more pronounced during stressful moments. "And what do you want, Richard?" "I've been thinking about something Catherine once said," he replied, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. "She told me that real change doesn't come from working within broken systems. It comes from having the courage to build new ones." He turned to face Maya directly. "I'm stepping down as CEO." Maya's eyes widened. "Richard, that's your family's company. Your life's work." "No," he corrected gently. "That was my father's life's work. Building something that maintained the status quo, while generating wealth for a privileged few. I want my life's work to be something different." He pulled out a folder containing preliminary plans for expanding the foundation. "I want to commit my full time and resources to what we've started." Maya was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Then she reached into her bag and withdrew several letters, the job offers she'd received. One by one, she tore them in half. "The gallery needs me," she said firmly. "Our community needs spaces like this, led by people who understand their experiences. Running away to a prestigious museum won't change the system. It will just make me part of it." They sat on the bench together, the autumn sun warming their faces. Richard thought about how different his life had become since that first night at the gala. Maya considered how far they'd come from their initial suspicion and guardedness. "We'll face opposition," Maya said, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. "Good," Richard replied. "Opposition means we're changing things that need to be changed." The ring caught the sunlight, sending bright reflections across the water. Both of them looked at it, thinking about the women who had worn it before, who had made their own difficult decisions in harder times. The choice they were making felt like both an ending and a beginning, an ending to their old ways of living, and a beginning of something more meaningful than either had imagined possible. During the Foundation's first official board meeting, held in the renovated community center that would serve as their headquarters, a remarkable discovery emerged that would transform everyone's understanding of their shared history. Sarah Chun, a historian they'd hired to document the Foundation's origins, requested time to present her preliminary research findings. The community room fell silent as Sarah projected a black and white photograph onto the screen. The image showed a group of women gathered around a table, papers spread before them. Richard immediately recognized Elizabeth Wells, and Maya identified Rose Johnson, but it was the document visible on the table that caught Sarah's attention. While digitizing the Wells family archives, Sarah explained, her voice trembling slightly with the excitement of discovery, I found a series of letters and meeting minutes from a secret organization called The Circle. This group, operating from 1960 to 1968, consisted of women from both privileged and working-class backgrounds who worked together to support civil rights initiatives. She clicked to the next slide, showing a handwritten manifesto. Elizabeth Wells and Rose Johnson weren't just employer and employee who became friends. They were founding members of this organization. The ring, she gestured toward Maya's hand, was their symbol of membership. Richard leaned forward, his heart racing as Sarah revealed more details. The Circle had used Elizabeth's social events as cover for their real work, channeling funds to civil rights organizations, establishing educational programs, and creating safe spaces for interracial dialogue. The ring, with its distinctive Art Deco design, had been replicated for each core member, serving as both identification and commitment to their cause. Maya's voice was barely audible as she asked, "How many rings were there?" 7, Sarah answered, displaying another document, each representing a different aspect of their mission. Education, legal aid, healthcare, housing, employment, arts, and social justice. The women who wore them pledged to work together across racial and class boundaries to create lasting change. Richard suddenly understood why Catherine had felt such an immediate connection to the ring when he'd found it at the estate sale. Perhaps some part of her had recognized its significance, its connection to her grandmother's secret life of activism and courage. Sarah continued, revealing how the Circle had influenced policy changes, supported landmark civil rights cases, and created networks of support that extended far beyond New York. Their work, though never publicly acknowledged, had helped shape the progress of the civil rights movement in ways that were only now coming to light. The last meeting minutes we have, Sarah concluded, show that the members made a pact. They agreed that if their rings ever found their way back together, it would be a sign that their work needed to continue in a new form, for a new era. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone present. Richard and Maya exchanged glances, understanding flowing between them. Their chance meeting at the gala, the immediate recognition of the ring, their growing partnership, none of it had been purely coincidental. Richard stood slowly, emotion making his voice rough. Our grandmothers didn't just leave us a legacy, he said. They left us a mission. This foundation isn't just about arts and education. It's about continuing their vision of bringing people together across the divisions that still plague our society. Maya joined him at the front of the room, the ring gleaming on her hand. The Circle understood something fundamental, she added. Real change happens when people from different backgrounds come together, when we recognize our common humanity and work together for justice. The Foundation's mission expanded that day, incorporating all 7 aspects of the Circle's original vision. Richard and Maya's personal relationship, too, deepened with the understanding that they were part of a story much larger than themselves, a story of love, courage, and the ongoing work of building bridges across the chasms that divide us. As the meeting concluded, Maya caught Richard looking at the ring with new understanding. It was never just about art, was it? He asked softly. No, she replied, smiling. It was always about love, love for justice, love for humanity, and the kind of love that gives people the courage to stand against the tide of history and say, we choose a different way. The ring that had once symbolized loss and mystery now represented something else entirely, a promise kept, a legacy honored, and a future where the boundaries of race and class would continue to fade in the face of shared purpose and understanding.